The winter of 1942 to 1943 delivered a strategic and psychological blow. The Wehrmacht would never truly recover from this shock. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad marked the definitive loss of strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. General Oberst Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the invasion, was reduced to a starving, freezing remnant. Hitler's rigid refusal to permit a full retreat condemned 201,000 men to a slow death by cold and starvation. Their fate was sealed by the Luftwaffe's failure to deliver more than a fraction of the necessary supplies. By late January 1943, the few remaining German tanks were immobilized. They were reduced to spare parts bins by cannibalization or simply frozen solid due to lack of fuel. The surrender of Paulus on January 31st, followed by the last troops on February 2nd, was the climax of Operation Koltso. This operation began with a massive 55-minute Soviet artillery barrage designed to pulverize the remaining German positions. Retreating soldiers were seen carrying frozen comrades. They subsisted on minimal rations, in daily temperatures often dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The human cost was immense. It sapped the troops' will to fight and cost Germany an irreplaceable body of experienced personnel and material. The Soviet Stavka immediately capitalized on this collapse. They launched widespread offensives that leveraged their growing mastery of combined arms warfare. The Red Army was learning to coordinate massed artillery and mechanized forces for deep thrusts. This capability proved devastating against the weakest links in the German line, the poorly equipped Axis Allied forces. The Ostrogozhsk-Rostov offensive exemplified this new operational competence. It was launched against a vast, porous 186-kilometer sector held primarily by the Hungarian Second Army. These Allied forces were equipped with inadequate 37mm and 47mm anti-tank guns. Soviet forces, led by Vatutin's 40th Army and Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army, achieved a rapid breakthrough. The deep thrusts of Rybalko's armor threatened to sever all supply lines. The offensive successfully encircled and destroyed Axis forces. It created a massive 190-kilometer gap in Heeresgruppe B's front. The Italian Alpine Corps, realizing their hopeless predicament, began a desperate, unauthorized westward march across the snow. They suffered thousands of casualties in a brutal, freezing retreat. Simultaneously, Heeresgruppe A, led by Generaloberst Hermann Hoth, was conducting a desperate fighting retreat from the Caucasus. This was not a controlled maneuver, but a hazardous flight under immense Soviet pressure along a 610-kilometer route. Units like Panzerkorps I abandoned approximately 600 vehicles. They retained fewer than 40 operational tanks. The entire Panzer Armee Oberkommando I was described as a decimated horde of refugees when they finally crossed the pontoon bridge at Bataisk in early February. Even the deployment of 29 Tiger tanks failed to stem the tide. They were split, faced overwhelming odds, and were often rendered ineffective by logistical and mechanical faults. Amidst the chaos, German units fought localized, desperate holding actions. The ferocity of combat in January 1943 was nowhere more evident than in the costly relief attempts at Velikiye Luki. The city had been pounded into rubble. The garrison was encircled, reliant on air supply, and facing a determined Soviet enemy. Operation Totila, the German attempt to relieve them, involved moments of extreme desperation. A daring but futile attempt involved 9 tanks, 8 SP doubles, and an anti-aircraft vehicle. They attempted a high-speed dash through Soviet lines to resupply the garrison. The lead tank was destroyed at the Citadel Gateway, trapping the rest. Fewer than 200 German troops managed a final bloody breakout. Early Soviet offensives often achieved mixed results. They demonstrated both ambitious strategic goals and persistent logistical and coordination failures. Operation Iskra, designed to break the siege of Leningrad, saw Soviet forces field nearly 440 tanks against some 50 German tanks. Despite achieving the link-up that officially ended the siege, the Soviets lost around 200 tanks by the end of the month. This highlighted poor tactical employment. Operation Gallop, fueled by post-Stalingrad hubris, aimed for deep mobile warfare but quickly stalled. The audacious 85-kilometer night march of Polyboyarov's 4th Guards Tank Corps successfully cut German supply lines at Krasnoarmeyskoye. This breakthrough was rendered strategically meaningless. Days later, Popov's armor was immobilized not by enemy action, but by a crippling lack of fuel and ammunition. Despite these Soviet logistical hiccups, the strategic consequence of the winter fighting was clear. It resulted in the severe material exhaustion of the Oster. The desperate need for replacements, fuel, and functional equipment combined with the fundamental shift in the operational balance. The strategic initiative had passed, decisively and permanently, to the adaptable Red Army. The strategic collapse of the German front in the winter of 1942 to 1943 exposed a profound sickness within the German war machine. It extended far beyond the immediate shock of Stalingrad. That Heer's once feared Panzerdivisionen were now ghost formations. They were critically under strength due to Hitler's failure to maintain a strategic armoured reserve under the OKH. Resource diversion became a cancerous growth within the system. The vital equipment and experienced personnel were siphoned off to the Waffen-SS and Luftwaffe armoured formations. This was driven by the relentless lobbying of Himmler and Göring, directly starving the Heer's own revitalization efforts. The drain of the North African campaign, a strategic miscalculation, had cost Germany 3 Panzerdivisionen and 1 Panzergrenadier division by May 1943. This included over 300 tanks, irreplaceable losses desperately needed on the Eastern Front. The logistical house of cards that supported German armour was crumbling. The introduction of new, heavier tanks, the 44-ton Panther and the 54-ton Tiger, paradoxically strained the system further, as technological marvels were fuel hogs. They consumed over 700 litres per 100 kilometres, compared to the 340 litres of older models. Their weight made them difficult to recover and often too heavy for existing tactical bridges. This forced a doctrinal shift away from the lightning-speed maneuver warfare, or Bewegungskrieg, that had been the hallmark of early German success. They were now forced towards static defense and reliance on shock effect. This was a role for which their complexity and mechanical fragility were ill-suited. The Red Army, emboldened by its winter triumphs, sought to press its advantage with Operation Star. This massive offensive aimed at recapturing Kharkov. Stavka, however, fell prey to overextension and logistical hubris. Golikov's Voronezh front was directed toward multiple objectives, dispersing its already depleted forces. The 3rd Tank Army under General Pavel Rybalko was tired and critically undersupplied, having just completed the grueling Ostrogozhsk-Rososh operation. While they successfully liberated Kharkov on February 16th, the victory was premature. Rybalko's tank corps were running on fumes, lacking fuel, ammunition, and replacements. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, recognized the strategic opportunity presented by the Soviet overextension. While Hitler remained obsessed with holding ground, von Manstein skillfully concentrated his remaining elite forces. This included the well-rested SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Das Reich, LSSAH, and Totenkopf divisions, along with elements of the Grossdeutschland division. This force numbered fewer than 200 operational tanks and assault guns. It was a striking contrast to the thousands of armoured fighting vehicles the Soviets had fielded, yet it possessed superior cohesion and logistical support. Beginning on February 19th, von Manstein launched his counteroffensive, the backhand blow. He systematically exploited the Soviet logistical collapse. The SS Panzer Corps, with its superior firepower and combined arms tactics, rolled up the dispersed and immobilized Soviet units. The Popov's armored group, a primary threat, was effectively destroyed by February 22nd. The fighting was intense. Near Snezhkov Kut, Wunsch's 2nd Battalion of SS Panzer Regiment 1 engaged heavy anti-tank fire. Tank crews were forced to bail out into the snow, often suffering severe burns from the ensuing blasts. Crucially, as the SS Panzer Corps advanced on Kharkov, its commander, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, faced a crisis. Hitler and von Manstein demanded the city be held at all costs. Hauser, recognizing the imminent danger of encirclement and a protracted, bloody urban battle, made a pragmatic and unauthorized decision. He evacuated his forces on February 14th. This tactical flexibility, a stark defiance of Hitler's rigid no-retreat doctrine, saved the SS Panzer Corps from annihilation. The Germans recaptured Kharkov on March 14th after intense urban fighting. Graf Strakowitz's panzer crews leading the thrust for the Grossdeutschland division claimed significant Soviet tank kills. This was particularly true during a meticulously planned ambush near Borisovka on March 15th. German tanks opened fire in the twilight, turning the approaching T-34s into massive, exploding targets. By March 18th, the SS Panzerkorps had also captured Belgorod. The Third Battle of Kharkov was a tactical masterpiece for von Manstein. It temporarily restored the initiative to the Wehrmacht, however. The victory was strategically hollow. It had been achieved at immense cost, severely depleting the irreplaceable elite formations of the SS Panzerkorps. More than 5,000 Soviet tanks and over 2,000 German tanks were lost between January and March across the Eastern Front. The temporary German success forced both sides into a 3-month lull, from April to June 1943. This was a period of critical refitting and preparation that Hitler. The success validated his belief in the new heavy tanks and set the stage for one final decisive summer offensive, Operation Citadel. For the Soviets, the defeat was a brutal lesson in the necessity of securing logistics and maintaining cohesion. It hardened their resolve for the colossal confrontation that lay ahead at Kursk. The 3-month lull between April and June 1943 was less a period of rest and more a furious, secret arms race. This set the stage for the greatest tank battle in history. For Germany, the preparation for Operation Citadel was dominated by technological ambition and political folly. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, newly appointed Inspekteur der Panzertruppen, faced the monumental task of rebuilding his decimated divisions. His efforts were constantly undermined by Hitler's focus on complex, heavy designs. Guderian watched in dismay as crucial resources were poured into the new Panther tank. He knew this vehicle was fundamentally unready for the field. He warned the Führer that the Panther was not ready for combat, yet his technical analysis was rejected. This premature deployment would lead to what historians would later label the worst combat debut for any major weapon system in the Second World War. While the Germans struggled with internal mechanical flaws and logistical bottlenecks, the Soviets prepared. Guided by excellent intelligence, including crucial decrypts from the Allied Ultra program, they were building a defense of unprecedented scale and depth. The Soviets understood Hitler's intent to strike the Kursk salient. They used the German delay, caused by Hitler's insistence on waiting for adequate numbers of Tigers and Panthers, to full effect. Under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's direction, the Red Army constructed 6 defensive belts. This was a vast network of trenches, artillery emplacements, and anti-tank defenses stretching nearly 300 kilometers deep. The ground was seeded with 500,000 anti-tank mines and nearly as many anti-personnel mines. This created killing zones of up to 1,600 mines per kilometer in expected armored mobility corridors. The strategic reserve, the Steppe Front, was amassed silently behind these fortifications. It was a massive armored fist waiting to deliver the counterblow. Operation Citadel began on July 5, 1943, with a massive artillery preparation. However, German planning was fatally flawed, as Sekra was a critical underestimation of Soviet defensive depth and an acute lack of unity of command. The technological advantages of the new tanks immediately dissolved into logistical nightmares on the Northern Front. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group 9 slammed into the dense Soviet minefields and defenses around Olkovatka and Ponyri. The advance quickly devolved into a bitter battle of attrition. Participants described it as Stalingrad-style urban combat, with Model's forces suffering catastrophic personnel and equipment losses. Despite committing 90 Ferdinand tank destroyers, massive, powerful but slow vehicles, Model advanced barely 15 kilometers in 6 days. He suffered over 22,000 casualties in the first week. Unable to achieve the necessary breakthrough, Model unilaterally suspended the offensive on the Northern Front by July 10th. This signaled the strategic failure of the entire Northern Pincer. On the Southern Front, the debut of the Panther tank was a disaster. Technical flaws, particularly transmission and final drive issues, were instantly exposed. During the advance of the Grossdeutschland Division, the Panthers encountered the flooded Berezovy Ravine. Strachwitz's commander failed to inform his subordinates of the obstacle, leading to chaos. Panthers bogged down, hit mines, and bunched up. This transformed the ravine into a chaotic kill zone where they were pounded by Soviet artillery and air attacks. Oberleutnant Erdmann Gabriel, caught in the inferno, described sustaining severe burns during the engagement. This was a stark human cost of technological failure. By the end of the first day, at least 25 Panthers were disabled. Many were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical breakdown. This phenomenon was so widespread that the area was grimly nicknamed the Panther Cemetery. The weight of heavy armor also proved crippling. Breith's 3 Panzer Corps was unable to cross the Donets River because the 58-ton Tigers had no adequate bridging. This effectively aborted a major portion of the southern attack before it even began. With the German assault stalling, the Soviets committed their armored reserves. On July 11th, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army began its march. This was despite 227 tanks and self-propelled guns falling out on the road march due to mechanical issues. The stage was set for the pivotal clash at Prokhorovka. The ensuing engagement on July 12th has been historically shrouded in myth. It is often portrayed as a decisive, colossal Soviet victory where the Panzerwaffe was crippled. The reality was more brutal and complex. Rotmistrov, fueled by hubris and a lack of intelligence, issued a rushed attack order. His 5th Guards Tank Army, comprising 612 tanks and self-propelled guns, attacked across 1,500 meters of open ground. They charged straight into prepared German positions held by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The Soviet first echelon, comprising 4 tank brigades, encountered an unexpected anti-tank ditch, thus brought their advance to a disastrous halt. Tanks ran directly into the obstacle, becoming static targets. By 9 a.m, these lead brigades were badly defeated. SS Sturmbannführer Martin Gross and Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop immediately exploited the vulnerability. They counterattacked with Tigers and Panzerfours. They destroyed 2 lead Soviet brigades at a distance of 800 meters, claiming over 60 kills in the initial minutes. But the 25th Tank Brigade alone lost 24 tanks to Marder 3 tank destroyers. Rotmistrov's subsequent echelons, committed piecemeal throughout the day, were easily repulsed. Kirichenko's 29th Tank Corps was devastated, losing 153 of its 199 armored fighting vehicles. Newer scholarship has decisively debunked the myth of a Soviet tactical triumph. Prokhorovka was a localized, mutually destructive clash where Soviet planning was tactically inefficient. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army ultimately lost 359 armored fighting vehicles. This was a disproportionate loss compared to the German forces, which suffered relatively modest armored losses. While the German elite units like Totenkopf and LSSAH incurred heavy personnel casualties and lost tanks that were often repairable, the human cost was immense. They lost irreplaceable veteran leaders and engineers. The final strategic turning point arrived on July 13th. Hitler, described as nervous and pensive by his staff, summoned von Manstein and von Klug. Despite von Manstein's insistence that victory on the southern front of the Kursk salient was within reach, Hitler was unsettled by perceived heavy losses. More critically, he was concerned by the successful Allied landing in Sicily on July 10th. He ordered the immediate halt of Operation Citadel. This decision, driven by political anxiety rather than tactical necessity, officially ended Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The strategic initiative, temporarily regained at Kharkov, was now relinquished forever. The balance of power decisively shifted to the Red Army, who now prepared to launch a relentless sequence of counter-offensives. The failure of Operation Citadel was immediately seized upon by the Red Army. They had meticulously prepared their counter-offensive, even as the German panzers hammered fruitlessly against the deep defensive belts. The strategic initiative, bought by the blood of hundreds of thousands of infantrymen and tankers at Kursk, now belonged irrevocably to the Soviets. They wasted no time in unleashing 2 massive, coordinated counter-offensives. Operation Kutuzov aimed at the Orel salient. Operation Rumiantsev targeted the Belgorod-Kharkov axis. Operation Kutuzov, launched on July 12, was an operational triumph. It demonstrated the Red Army's newfound ability to coordinate multiple fronts. Bagramyan's 11th Guards Army, supported by overwhelming air superiority, achieved a rapid breakthrough against the German 293rd Infantry Division. The indecisiveness of German commanders like General Major Fackenstedt, who lacked crucial command experience, allowed Soviet exploitation forces to pour into the breach. These included the 1st and 5th Tank Corps, Field Marshal Walter Model, who took command of all German forces in the Orel salient, managed to redistribute panzers and conduct spoiling attacks. An effective counterattack by the 2nd and 8th Panzer Divisions knocked out 25 Soviet tanks. Major Savant's Tigers proved lethal, destroying 54 Soviet tanks near Teploy for the loss of just 2 of his own. Yet, these were tactical victories masking a strategic retreat. Despite the high cost to the Red Army, 429,890 casualties and 2,586 tanks lost over 38 days, the operation succeeded in liquidating the Orel salient. Model's forces suffered 80,000 casualties and lost 1/3 of their armor. They were forced to pull back to the Hagenstelling. The operation, though frustratingly costly in its tactical execution due to Zhukov's cautious approach, was an ominous preview of coming attractions for the Germans. It proved the Soviets could sustain complex, large-scale offensives. Simultaneously, the German High Command faced a crisis on the Munyus River. Hollett's Army Group 6, already under strength, was hammered by Tolbukin's southwest front, starting July 17th. The Soviet attack, massing mechanized and tank units, established a bridgehead. Von Manstein was forced to crush this bridgehead with his precious battle-weary reserves. This was where the true invisible cost of Kursk was paid. The elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the very formation that had spearheaded the attack at Prokhorovka, was immediately diverted south to repel the Soviet thrust. This move, necessary to prevent a collapse of the southern front, effectively burned out Germany's strongest armored formation. Operation Roland commenced on July 30th with a broad frontal attack. The lead Tigers of Totenkopf ran directly into a wall of Soviet mines and anti-tank guns, suffering devastating losses. SS Unterscharführer Rolf Stettner recounted the harrowing experience of his tank crew. 2 of them burned to death in the intense combat. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with 119 operational tanks, lost 73 tanks and 12 assault guns on the first day alone. The brutal fighting for Stepanovka on August 1st saw Das Reich finally capture the town after suffering heavy losses. Though the Germans achieved a tactical success by crushing the Soviet bridgehead, the price was catastrophic. Army Oberkommando 6 suffered 21,369 casualties. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was reduced to a mere 23 operational tanks. The Mies battles had forced von Manstein to disperse his armor and sacrifice the combat effectiveness of his elite units. This left the door wide open for the next decisive Soviet blow. Kharkiv. That blow came on August 3rd, with Operation Rumyantsev. This was a carefully planned combined arms effort targeting the now critically weakened German forces in the Kharkov-Belgorod sector. Von Manstein miscalculated Soviet recovery time and was unaware of the full extent of Soviet maskirovka, or deception, tactics. He had left the sector vulnerable. The transfer of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to the Meuse front and the 48th Panzer Corps to Operation Roland left Heeresgruppe Sud critically short of reserves. Operation Rumyantsev began with a massive 170-minute artillery preparation. This was followed by a ground assault that achieved a 14-kilometer penetration by nightfall. The initial breakthrough was so overwhelming that General Nikolai Vatutin immediately committed his mobile groups. The 1st and 5th Guards tank armies, totaling around 1,000 tanks, poured into the breach. The German response was desperate but ineffective. Major Karl von Seiver's remaining Panthers from Panzerabteilung 52 engaged Polkovnik Nikolai V. Morganov's T-34s at long range outside Tomarovka. But the scale of the Soviet advance was too great. Tomarovka was nearly surrounded by August 5th. This forced the Germans to blow up intact Panthers, as per Hitler's orders to deny them to the Soviets. The logistical situation for the Wehrmacht was now catastrophic. Operational tanks on the Eastern Front, which had peaked before Kursk, plummeted from 2,287 to just 926 by August 20th. Virtually all of von Manstein's armoured divisions were rendered combat ineffective. They were crippled by battle damage, lack of spare parts, and mechanical failures. The technological edge of the Panther and Tiger was meaningless without fuel, maintenance, or the capacity to recover them from the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Red Army relentlessly pushed the reeling Wehrmacht back toward the Dnieper River. The German retreat was not orderly. It was a desperate fighting withdrawal, over 150 kilometers. Hitler's envisioned defensive line, the Pantherstellung, or Wotanstellung, was more a propaganda soundbite than a truly impenetrable barrier. German forces were hampered by horse-drawn supply trains and the mechanical fragility of their new tanks. Major Fritz Fechner's Panther Battalion saw half its tanks become non-operational within 2 days due to defects. They simply could not outrun the Soviet momentum. The Red Army's advance demonstrated significantly improved command and control. They showed enhanced coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery. They displayed a grim willingness to absorb immense losses while maintaining persistent offensive pressure. The sheer scale of the Soviet operation, involving over 2 million troops, shattered German morale. The ultimate strategic objective was the Dnieper River. This massive natural barrier was intended by Hitler to be an impregnable bulwark. The Soviet crossing was a brutally costly mass effort. Initial attempts were marked by tactical failures. Notably, an airborne assault southwest of the Bukrin bridgehead was quickly deemed a 3-star mess. Paratroopers landed directly into waiting German panzer grenadiers. Yet, the Soviets learned fast that German hesitation and internal strategic debates granted the Red Army a crucial week-long respite. This allowed them to ferry vital heavy weapons and tanks across the river. Crucially, Soviet Maskirovkas successfully concealed the transfer of Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army to the Lutezh bridgehead north of Kiev. While German attention was focused elsewhere, Rybalko assembled his entire armoured force. On November 3rd, following a massive artillery preparation, the Soviet breakout commenced. It annihilated German defences and shoved aside the 8th Panzer Division. By the early morning of November 6th, motorized infantry raised the red flag in Kiev. The liberation of the Ukrainian capital marked a major strategic and psychological victory. It confirmed the failure of the Dnieper Line and permanently established Soviet operational dominance on the Eastern Front. The degradation of German Panzer-Divisionen was now complete. They were reduced to fighting desperately for survival. Their ability to wage offensive war was broken by the strategic consequences of Kursk and the relentless Soviet advance. The liberation of Kiev in November 1943 confirmed the irreversible shift of the strategic initiative. However, the German High Command, shackled by Hitler's pathological insistence on holding ground, refused to accept reality. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South was now a combat casualty. It was an eviscerated shell of its former self, forced into a continuous sequence of costly, tactical counterattacks west of the Dnieper. As desperate maneuvers highlighted the fatal paradox of German armour. The elite panzer divisions relied entirely on the technological superiority of the Panther and Tiger, yet this edge was a mirage. During the counteroffensives around Zhytomyr and Brusilov in late 1943, the mechanical unreliability of the Panther proved crippling. Within a single week, over 50 Panther tanks of the 1st Panzer Division alone were sidelined. They were lost not by Soviet fire, but by internal defects. The German war effort was now fighting 2 enemies: the Red Army and its own flawed technology. Von Manstein's attempts to justify these losses and appease the Führer led to exaggerated claims. Those made after the Battle of Radomyshil in December, where paltry prisoner hauls were cited, revealed the bold lies intended to mask the reality of strategic defeat. As the Germans hemorrhaged irreplaceable veterans and equipment, the Soviets demonstrated a superior, pragmatic industrial strategy. By late 1943, they had decisively achieved armoured superiority. They maintained a consistent 3-to-1 production edge. They focused on the reliable T-34-85, a design that sacrificed complexity for mass production and durability. The Soviets rapidly reconstituted their losses. By December 20, 1943, Katukov's 1st Tank Army was back to 42,000 troops and 546 armoured fighting vehicles, ready to strike again. Meanwhile, the German 4th Panzer Army had only 46% of its armour operational. The Red Army's operational mastery came to the fore in early 1944, initially achieved through the devastating use of double envelopment tactics. The crisis began in late January with the Korsun-Cherkassy offensive. The 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, under Vatutin and Konev, executed a perfect pincer movement. Approximately 59,000 German troops were trapped in the Korsun pocket. Hitler's rigid no-retreat order condemned the encircled forces, led by General Stemmermann, to fight as a fortress. Von Manstein assembled a counterattack force, but the relief efforts were plagued by logistical strain and catastrophic blunders. The most debilitating enemy, however, was the weather. The Ukrainian Rasputitsa, The mud season, caused by rain and melting snow, turned the ground into a viscous, bottomless quagmire. Primitive German two-wheel drive Opel Blitz supply trucks were virtually immobilized, grinding the logistical chain to a halt. The heavily armored German relief spearheads, Panthers and Tigers, became fuel-starved, bogged-down targets. A particularly disastrous maneuver was the four-star fiasco of the 1st Panzer Regiment 26's attack. Inexperienced Panther crews blundered directly into waiting Soviet anti-tank units. Despite the desperate attempts of 3 Panzer Corps, the relief effort stalled at Lysianka. The trapped German forces, subsisting on meager airdrops, realized their fate. On the night of February 16th to 17th, Group Stemmermann began a desperate, unauthorized breakout across the frozen, partially thawed Gineloi-Tikich River. It was a scene of unparalleled human misery. Thousands of men, exhausted and starving, abandoned their heavy weapons and vehicles. Many drowned or froze to death in the icy waters under relentless Soviet fire. Of the 59,000 encircled, only 35,199 reached friendly lines. They had sacrificed virtually all their equipment. The relief forces themselves suffered crippling losses, further depleting the irreplaceable armored reserves. Meanwhile, on the northern front, Hitler's obstinacy led to another disaster. His refusal to allow strategic withdrawals around Leningrad led to the Soviet offensive from the Oranienbaum salient in January 1944. This shattered the German L Army Corps. The ferocious defense of Narva, where men like Oberleutnant Otto Carius and his Tigers of Heavy Panzer Battalion 502 fought fanatically in delaying actions, could only buy time. It came at an unsustainable cost. The final, decisive strategic blow was set up by a profound German intelligence failure. The OKH misjudged the main Soviet threat, anticipating offensives in the Ukraine. Crucially, they overlooked the true danger lurking in the central sector. On May 29th, the 56th Panzer Corps was transferred from Heeresgruppe Mitte to the threatened south. This left the center critically vulnerable. Heeresgruppe Mitte, holding a massive front, was left with a mere 111 tanks and 382 assault guns. It was a defensive line made of paper. On June 22, 1944, Operation Bagration commenced. It delivered the final strategic verdict of the war. Stalin's forces, having achieved mastery of deep battle and sophisticated Maskirovka, struck Heeresgruppe Mitte with 4 fronts and over 2,700 tanks. It was a tidal wave. Hitler's rigid no-retreat orders, obeyed without question by commanders like Busch, ensured widespread encirclement. German resistance quickly dissolved. The 53rd Army Corps was surrounded at Vitebsk, and the annihilation was swift. By June 29th, Bobruisk fell, resulting in the death or capture of approximately 70,000 German troops. The Red Army's advance was relentless. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army and other armored formations poured into the collapsing lines. They crossed the Berezina River and liberated Minsk by July 3rd. The destruction of Heeresgruppe Mitte, with 3 of its armies annihilated, was the strategic catastrophe that sealed the war in the east. The subsequent Lvov-Sandomierz operation pushed the Red Army to the Vistula River. It threatened to isolate Heeresgruppe Nord entirely. The final, pathetic symbol of German technological overreach came later that summer. The combat debut of the gargantuan King Tiger, or Tiger II, on the Eastern Front was disastrous. Out of 45 deployed, 37 immediately broke down due to mechanical faults. The ultimate humiliation occurred when a single Soviet T-34-85, piloted by Lieutenant Alexander Peroskin, famously destroyed 3 of these supposedly invincible behemoths. The German narrative of superior technology was finally shattered. By the end of August 1944, the path was cleared for the Red Army to advance deep into Poland and toward Germany itself. The war in the East had been strategically decided, not by overwhelming numbers alone, but by superior Soviet operational skill and German strategic and logistical self-sabotage.